You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 17th of March 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Ukraine's future to be discussed by two men whose commitment to its best interests is debatable. Can you reform teenage hoodlums by giving them jobs? And the car manufacturer wondering if they might have been overcomplicating matters. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Elizabeth Braw and Michael Binion will discuss the day's big stories, and our team at MIPIM meet the mayor of a Polish city reinventing itself as a pioneer of green urbanism. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Elizabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and the author of Goodbye Globalisation, and by Michael Binion, Foreign Affairs Specialist at The Times. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hello.
Elizabeth, first of all, as I understand it, you have recently been up a big hill in Italy.
I have the Hill of the Dolomites.
That's several big hills.
Indeed, and it's a long drive from the airport, and preferably you fly into Venice. But what you are reminded of being there, and I was there for a military conference, which is very appropriate because it was in the Dolomites that the Italians defended with great sacrifice, great effort and great sacrifice, defended themselves during World War I, and Italy since then has done quite well setting up Alpine troops that specialize in this very thing. But back then in World War I, they didn't have that specialization, and as a result, many soldiers perished. And it's worth remembering these days that those who have gone before us have made tremendous sacrifices so that we can enjoy the freedom that we still enjoy.
They are quite a breed, the mountain warrior. I once spent a few days in the south of France with the Chasseurs Alpins, the French Army's mountain warfare regiment, which mercifully did not include the full-dress winter warfare training in which they literally climb up an Alp and dig beds out of the snow and sleep in them. We were a bit further down the hill, mercifully. But I'm glad you mentioned Venice, because, Michael, moving seamlessly along, you're going there.
I am indeed, but I'm afraid it's for pure pleasure.
Which is the journalist's lament, which means they have failed to find some way of getting someone else to pay for it.
Exactly. I'm paying out of my own fair pocket. I'm paying for, but it's just worth the indulgence and the luxury. I have been there many times before, courtesy, I have to say, of the Italian government, who used to, and still do, organise wonderful seminars for British journalists in Venice, which are very helpful and very good. But I've been going to them many years.
What are their views on Australian journalists? Do you know?
Oh, too far, too distant. No, you need to get.
But I'm right here, Michael. Is my point. If they are listening,
if they're listening, yes. Well, it's a wonderful city for either pleasure or work or both.
Well, we will start rather less glamorously with tomorrow's scheduled phone call between US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Hard to know which of them to feel sorrier for. The call is supposed to be a follow-up to last week's pitch by the US and Ukraine for a 30-day ceasefire, to which Russia responded with so many conditions and caveats as to amount to a rejection. Ahead of the call, Trump has vaguely trailed that he hopes to discuss the division of assets, including land and power plants. Putin's proxies, meanwhile, are insisting that any settlement must preclude NATO membership for Ukraine or Western troops in Ukraine. Michael, if you were Ukrainian, how confident are you feeling right now?
Not at all. I think I'd be very worried. I think I'd know that they've already lost the eastern part that the Russians have occupied, because Trump has more or less told Putin, that's yours. We're not going to insist on getting it back. But the high idea that power plants and other things, the whole deal seems to be getting more and more murky and more in favour of what Putin has put out as his preconditions for any kind of ceasefire. And I think Putin's quite clever at playing statesman up to the point where he turns them against him, and he will be careful not to reject the ceasefire outright because he knows that Trump would then suddenly flip and be furious and say, I've had it with Vladimir Putin. But he'll string Trump along as best he can. He will come to some some kind of arrangement, I think. There will be a token ceasefire, which the Russians will exploit. But the follow-up, which is the important thing, which is what will happen, whether there will be a peace deal, and in that case, how will it be patrolled, I don't think will be discussed at all. The Russians will simply say we're not having NATO troops on our soil. Although, meanwhile, the NATO troops, European only, are frantically making plans to try to patrol a so-called peace if it ever comes.
I will come back to who might be patrolling any post-war settlement, but on the subject of the post-war settlement, Elizabeth, is that what we think it's going to look like? Russia will get to keep Luhansk, Donetsk, Crimea. Ukraine will probably be nudged towards the European Union, and Russia has repeatedly said they're not actually bothered about that. It's Ukraine being in NATO that upsets them. But everybody could just sort of agree not to discuss that. That could get kicked down the road and thought about 10, 20 years from now. Is that what this is going to look like?
Apparently so, although I have to say Russia does dislike the prospect of Ukraine joining the European Union, but less than it dislikes the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO. But we should remember that Ukraine taking this turn towards the European Union was what prompted the whole showdown in 2014,
Indeed.
Which was then followed by the invasion in 2022. But Andrew, I think what's unusual about this talk tomorrow, this conversation, is that it's Trump and Putin discussing peace in Ukraine. Ordinarily, when you have peace negotiations, they involve the two parties that are fighting, in this case, would be Russia and Ukraine, with a mediator. Typically, a country like Norway would take on that role, or Switzerland. So it is a little bit unusual to have this talk between Russia and the United States following a talk between between the United States and Ukraine. Why not have Ukraine and Russia negotiate with a mediator? But clearly that's not the way it has been envisaged this time, although that's what Ukraine wanted. But coming back to your question, what seems inevitable is that Ukraine will have to give up some of these territories. Indeed, Trump himself said as much a few hours ago, and it was unusual and then frankly quite unexpected that he would go as far as to float the idea that Ukraine would also would have to give up certain power facilities. That was quite a detailed advanced look at what might come out of these talks.
To go back to that point you raised, Michael, about who might patrol or enforce any conditions of a ceasefire, again, we have heard from Russia that they don't want Ukraine in NATO, and nor do they want any NATO militaries in Ukraine under any circumstance, although, of course, there have been NATO militaries operating in Ukraine in one way or another for years, and Russia well knows this. There's the training operations run by the Canadians and the Brits. It's now fairly well understood that special forces have been operating alongside Ukrainian troops all along, etc. But President Macron of France, that is, has also reminded that Ukraine doesn't need Russia's permission to host allied troops. But is the middle ground prospect then possibly some sort of even UN-endorsed peacekeeping force?
Well, it could be, but of course Russia has a veto at the UN, so that's rather difficult to
But might Russia agree to something which, like many UN peacekeeping forces, is one, largely ineffectual, and two, doesn't actually involve any Western militaries? You could have a peacekeeping force of, I don't know, Argentinians and Bangladeshis commanded by a South African.
You could, yes, and that would probably be as ineffective as anything you could possibly want. And for Russia, that might be a face-saving way of finally agreeing to some kind of deal. The Russians do want a deal of some sort, because they not only over Ukraine, but they really want a deal with America, particularly to get them off the economic hook. They've managed to cope pretty well with sanctions, but not that well. The economy in the long term is not looking very good. They're highly reliant on others to try to source vital kind of Western technology and things they can't get at the moment. They would like a reset of relations with America, but that would certainly help them. And that is part of the reason that they're ready to go along with some sort of deal. And if a UN-endorsed peacekeeping force is the price for it, well, they might. But I think they will prevaricate over that. Meanwhile, the Europeans are all gearing themselves up for this, Britain and France in the lead, and I rather think it's a sort of more than a theoretical exercise than an actual possible deployment.
Elizabeth, just finally on this, another non-participant in this phone call tomorrow, apart from Ukraine, will of course be Europe, which has been frantically trying to have other ideas these last few weeks. Does Europe actually have any options? Can it come up with something that doesn't involve the United States? Does it have any carrots or sticks it can brandish at Russia which will have any effect?
Not really, but the United States doesn't exactly have that many choices either, short of military action. The sanctions that make sense have already been imposed. They've been in place for some time. But what we do have on the European side, both among NATO's European members and within the European Union, is willingness to do something which is not to be taken for granted. Not that long ago, people were predicting that Europe, quote unquote, would somehow disintegrate over this. And now we have seen unexpected unity. That doesn't immediately translate, as Michael said, into a cohesive, let alone a forceful peacekeeping force, should one be requested. But it is better having this unity than having disunity, and that, by the way, includes countries that have been that struggle internally about what position to take on Ukraine, such as Italy, and so it is at the very least a good starting point.
Well, moving along somewhat, one reason that Vladimir Putin might have for taking Trump's call tomorrow is that he and everybody else can no longer glean the US perspective on things by tuning into the Voice of America. Trump has signed an executive order which will effectively silence VOA, claiming it was broadcasting left-leaning anti-American propaganda, which, ironically enough, is exactly what decades of left-leaning anti-American types have accused VOA of doing. Trump's order will likely have similar effects on Radio Free Europe and Radio Free Asia, established as platforms to broadcast to foreign countries imprisoned by communism. Michael, first of all, to the always interesting exercise of attempting to divine Donald Trump's motives for doing anything, why would he close Voice of America? You would think that the branding alone would appeal to him enormously.
Yes, you would. It is a relic of the Cold War, and I think this is part of his knee-jerk reaction. Putin doesn't like it. I mean, the Russians have never liked it, and even more so, they don't like and didn't like Radio Free Europe, which was overtly broadcasting into the Soviet Union. It was broadcasting very good stuff, very detailed stuff.
Indeed, so, and to be clear, still does, or at least
very
did.
Harmful to Russia, harmful to the system, because it was very good on exposing corruption and naming names and getting into the intricacies of what's going on inside Russia and in the past in the Soviet Union as a whole. I think Trump also thinks, why do we pay this money? It doesn't affect ordinary Americans. The voters for Trump don't care a fig about it, really. They don't really even know about it, and therefore he can just say, I'm cutting costs, I'm going to stop this. And I suppose he feels that it is, funnily enough, the rest of the world used to think it was sort of right-wing Cold War propaganda. If Trump thinks it's left-wing stuff, it shows how far the political dial has switched over now.
Well, indeed so, but the obvious objection to this, Elizabeth, would seem to be that this is ceding the information space to Russia and China, who are spending profusely on their own foreign media outreach.
They are indeed, and in addition to the outlets you mentioned, Andrew, there's also the Middle East Broadcasting Network that was also shut down on Saturday. A letter arrived from Kari Lake, who doesn't have. She's not a director, but has been appointed some sort of advisor, failed candidate to the Senate, and she informed the director that the federal grant had ended, meaning it will no longer be funded. So. Yes, this means America cedes information space in many, many countries, but and you can say it will damage America. It will let other countries, namely China and Russia, dominate the information space. But it's somehow still in line with Trump's worldview, which seems to be that powerful leaders matter, smaller countries don't matter that much, and ordinary citizens apparently don't matter that much either. And if he had bothered, though, to inform himself about the conditions under which, well, first of all, the recipients, the people who consume the news that VOA produces, that Radio Free Europe produces, and others, then he would have realized what good value for money these news outlets are. Yes, they do cost the American taxpayer some money, but what America gets out of it in goodwill, and frankly, just understanding among people who don't have access to factual information about the conditions in their own neighborhood, that is really valuable.
I mean, all of which I agree with entirely. But, Michael, why are Western governments in particular, not just ones as cranky and isolationist as Donald Trump's, so reluctant to make this argument? Because we have an echo of the same thing here in the United Kingdom. According to figures doing the rounds at the moment, Russia and China spending £8 billion per year between them on this sort of media outreach. The total budget of the BBC World Service is 400 million quid, which in the context of the UK's annual outgoings is absolute beans. It is under pressure to cut another 130 jobs this year. It is very arguably, I think, in my own experience of reporting from places where people listen to it, possibly the single most trusted brand on earth. Why do governments of all ideological stripes in this country recoil from making that argument to voters?
It's a mystery and it's a terrible shame, and I think it's one of the greatest single betrayals of Britain's influence overseas. I mean, people used to say the BBC and the British Council, BBC World Service and the British Council, were the two things that were the real instruments of so-called soft power overseas. They projected an image of Britain, but the problem is that neither of them were really well known by the people in this country. And what they did hear of them, they thought, well, what's that to do with us? They didn't listen or receive English instructions, say, from British Council teachers or broadcasts from the BBC World Service. And I think the rot started when the Foreign Office was no longer going to give the block grant to fund the World Service, so that meant the BBC as a whole had to find the money out of its own budget, which of course conflicted with its domestic spending. And the BBC domestic spending on its domestic programmes is already under pressure because of Netflix and because of all the other broadcasters. And they are now finding it increasingly difficult to put on trending, important programmes at home. They are looking for cuts wherever they can, and it's just a question of money, and the government is not ready to step in, and it feels that voters don't care, which on the whole I think is true.
Well, let's move along now to Sweden, which, contrary to its reputation for order and placidity, has in recent years seen a grim culture of gang-related violence develop among cohorts of largely immigrant youth. Even aside from outlier occurrences like February's massacre at a school in Örebro, Sweden now has one of the highest shooting homicide rates in Europe and averages around one bombing per day. Many of the perpetrators are children. A consortium of dozens of Swedish companies has now established a program which hopes to neutralise the menace of unruly youth by employing them. Elizabeth, first of all, before we look at the proposed solution, give us some idea of the problem. How bad has this got in Sweden?
It's extraordinary. It's a tragedy what has been occurring over the past 10, 15, 20 years, which is that a country that used to be so orderly and based really on the social contract where you do your best and the government, the state, society looks after you if you fall on hard times or if you struggle. That social contract has been broken by people who frankly don't do their best and instead engage in crime. And as you said, unfortunately, it's not just petty crime, it is organized crime, it's serious crime, and it involves shootings, and I should have added, it's based on the drug market and turf wars over who controls certain areas, and these gangs engage in constant conflict with one another, which results in regular shootings, almost daily shootings, and now also bombings. And so if you look, for example, even in smaller towns, there are now bombings and shootings as well. It's extraordinary and as I said, tragic, and nobody knows quite what to do about it. The current government is trying, but where do you start when you have gangs operating with such a feeling of impunity? Because they've been getting away with it for so long. And then if you, as the current government has done, try to impose sharper sentences, then they instead recruit children. And where do you go from there?
Just to follow that up, though, Elizabeth, you mentioned that Swedish culture of the state will provide, the state will look after you. That's what you get for paying these extraordinary taxes. But in this specific instance, it does sound like the state and particularly the police have completely failed. Is there a simple reason for that? Is it just that Swedish police had for decades and decades and decades got used to the idea that the most difficult thing they would ever have to deal with was the odd stolen Volvo, and they just weren't equipped to deal with gang war?
They have in no way failed these people. It is a case of society having tried every measure of inclusion, of social programs, of in the case of the police, neighborhood patrols. But the Swedish, like the British way of policing, is largely policing by consent and not being overly violent. That it doesn't really work against organized criminals who have no hesitation about using weapons, and we have seen several police officers killed on duty, patrolling the streets, being shot and killed while patrolling the streets. So this is something really completely new, or gradually new, and getting worse by the month, and that's. It really seems unsolvable, and it is really a society operating within society, almost like a tumor growing, and without the rest of society understanding what can be done about it.
Well, here is an idea of what can be done about it, Michael, which is this idea that several, actually quite a lot of Swedish companies will try and find a way to enlist on a part-time basis for the purposes of paid employment numbers of kids from early teens onwards. Does this sound to you like something worth a try?
It's certainly worth a try, because one of the big things that has been the problem right from the start is integration of people who've arrived. And many of the people who've arrived in Sweden, which had a very liberal, open door, I would say admirable policy of allowing refugees and those fleeing violence to come to Sweden, the trouble is those fleeing violence had in their background and had in their minds a society that was dominated by violence. So some of those habits have come with them, and unfortunately there wasn't a real attempt to integrate these groups within wider Swedish society. For a start, not many of them spoke Swedish, or hardly any of them did, and they didn't really fit in, and so they live in ghettos where they then revert to their own kind of moral code. I won't say that it's definitely less moral, but it's a background that has more violence in it from for historic reasons. So to try to integrate the young ones, particularly, with other Swedish kids in a program of employment is a very good idea. When you're working and when you're earning money by legitimate means, you're much more at ease with the society around you than if you're just hanging around or reluctantly trying to study at school and not doing anything.
Is this likely to be popular with Swedish voters, Elizabeth? The reason I ask is that there is a stereotype attached to the Nordic countries that, as well as being liberal, they are practical. They often appear often appearing on British television, like Swedish and Norwegian jails, to invite British people to be scandalised by how pleasant and comfortable they are relative to British ones. And however often the point is made that, but this works, nobody ever comes back. British people, I think, are still just inclined to, horror at the idea that, that the criminal justice system should do anything other than punish. So is something like this, will it be popular in Sweden? Will people see it as rewarding criminality, or will they just be thinking, if it works, great?
But I think the idea is to catch these teenagers before they get involved in heavy crime. I don't think any voters would endorse a program that would give them the option of working rather than serving the punishment for whatever the crime they've committed. And we should remember these are very serious crimes, murder attempts and successful murders, as it were. But if you can get to them before they get to that point, then why not? And I think Swedish voters more generally are keen for anything to be attempted, in any effort, any initiative to be attempted that can halt this really appalling development.
Because just finally on this, Michael, by way of contrast, were a similar thing suggested here in the United Kingdom on a scale of 1 to Krakatoa? How nuts would the Daily Mail go?
Well, if it doesn't cost a lot more, after all, if they're working, they're producing something, they're in the workforce. I mean, the problem is to engage a lot of younger people in the workforce. In any case, we have too many people who, for all sorts of different reasons, some of them, I have to say, not very legitimate reasons, have simply dropped out of the workforce. And we are actually short of the people we need in all kinds of different fields. So if one tries to bring in younger people, particularly in an apprentice scheme or something where they would learn something valuable and become useful members of society, all the better. I'm not sure that we need it particularly for integration reasons or for crime-stopping reasons, so it would probably be worth trying. There is a problem in Britain with gang culture, particularly in the big cities and particularly in London, and the police have struggled with that. Now, that may be an area where you could try to employ people to bring in special arrangements for work among those who might be drawn into gangs. But I don't think the alienation, and I don't think the problem with relation to the rest of society, luckily, is quite as bad in Britain as it has now become in Sweden.
Well,
just add a point on prisons and jobs. There is a fantastic initiative in London and maybe elsewhere, which is restaurants run in prisons, and I highly recommend the Clink in HMP Brixton. This is how to turn lemons into lemonade, as it were.
Yes.
Well, now to one of those occasional heartwarming incidents of it finally getting through to those who impose technological innovation upon us, that quite a lot of digital wizardry annoys the living bejeebers out of actual consumers. Volkswagen, like most car manufacturers, has increasingly lit up the dashboards of its latest models with digital touchscreens, but appears to have discovered that many motorists do not much care for them. Accordingly, Volkswagen is restoring physical buttons for such functions as fans, heating, hazard lights and sound system volume. Michael, I don't want to suggest that your first car was started by means of a hand crank and had a little guy with a red flag walking in front of it, but where are you on this?
Oh, I'm absolutely with what Volkswagen are doing now. I mean, the idea of a digital touchscreen is madness. First of all, I mean, the recent research has shown it's much more dangerous because unless you know instinctively where on the screen to put your finger, you actually have to take your eyes off the road and look at the screen instead of driving. With a button, you know more or less where it is, and you can continue driving, looking at the road, press the button, and you put on your heater or whatever it is. Much easier, quicker, easier to operate. And also, of course, if you're a complete technophobe like me, you don't really understand what all these various flashing things mean. And they always give you more choices than you could possibly need. So it's plain madness thinking that you're sitting in a control room when you're actually meant to be driving a car.
Well, Volkswagen's design chief, Andreas Mint, Elizabeth, has been quoted as saying it's a car, not a phone, something you would have thought he might have figured out beforehand. But should people think of them necessarily differently? I mean, aren't they both appliances? in different price ranges, but I was hoping to disagree with Michael, but instead I will wholeheartedly agree with him. And I think this is actually a mistake that is often made now that we have amazing technology available that does put
were given the opportunity to design things for us to buy, go a little bit bananas over the opportunity to design really spectacular things. And they don't realize that all we need is a button to push and feel confident about pushing it, so that we know that we won't accidentally cause a car crash while trying to find whatever it was. It may be that even something as lowly as the heating.
I did want to end by asking you each in turn. I'll ask you first, Michael, if there are any other sort of modern, fancy technological innovations that you would happily abolish or reverse.
Almost all of them. Yeah, I mean, so many things. I'm almost, though I have to say I won't, going back to a sort of simple phone that doesn't have 10 different options for doing it, because you get confused and then you suddenly find I've got lost amid the maze of all these different options. I would try to make modern technology with fewer choices. It's the plethora of choices that makes it so difficult. Too many different things. You have to master so many different systems. And the other problem is they keep changing them. You got used to something, you know how to operate this or that, and then about a year later they come up with a so-called innovation, and it's all different.
Yes. Well, I mean, I speak as somebody who, Elizabeth, definitely misses the phone with the physical keyboard, which I just found it much, much easier and much, much more intuitive to type on than I ever have been able to get on with the digital screen. But is there anything that you would like to, anything of bygone years that you would like to revive, or anything of the present day that you would abolish?
There is. I would like to abolish the digital thermostat. That is a if you use Google, it's a Google Nest thing that sets the heat for the entire house, and you don't use the radiators to set the heat. Meaning, the thing on your app, you set the heat for the entire house. Well, what if you want to turn on the radiator in one room and not have it on in another room? Seems totally straightforward, right? But with Google Nest or similar, I'm not singling Google out, but similar digital thermostats, you can't do that. You set the same temperature for the whole house.
And which I will close with it was kind of a bonding conversation with the fellow who installed the dishwasher I currently have in my kitchen, and he was talking me through it, and he finished his little presentation by saying, and if you download the manufacturer's app, you will be able to control the dishwasher via your phone. To which I replied, in what imaginable circumstances would anybody want to do that? And he said, honestly, I have no idea, but, I work here. Elizabeth Braw and Michael Binion, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, once an industrial powerhouse, Łódź has undergone a remarkable transformation over the past couple of years, emerging as a leader in green urbanism, pedestrian-friendly design and climate resilience. From a remarkable project to restore and unearth its rivers to rethinking public spaces, the city is setting a new standard for livability in Central Europe. Monocle's editor-in-chief Andrew Tuck sat down with Adam Pustelnik, the first deputy mayor of Łódź, last week at MIPIM in Cannes. And Adam began by telling us a bit more about the story of his city.
We're kind of Polish version of Birmingham, or if you wish, a combination of Austin and Baltimore. It's a very highly industrialized area, around 1.1 million people in the agglomeration. It's located basically in the middle, in the very heart of Europe, and physically in the heart of Poland. So we are a huge place filled with factories, universities, and everything that creates this big, booming industrial ecosystem. And we are very proud of our industrial heritage. And when it comes to history, we are, I think, the most American city in Europe, quite young, 150 years old in the contemporary history, created by a capitalist boom. When you look at it from the top, it looks like Manhattan, parallel and perpendicular streets, which is completely different than most of the medieval cities in our country.
What are the challenges for you as deputy mayor, as a civic leadership? I know that you're doing lots of work around greening the city, trying to reconnect with the river. Because there's been so much focus on industrial growth, is it partly quality of life elements that you're now focusing on?
Quality of life is actually our main focus. If you are a city with such a heritage, with such a structure, you need to do really a lot of heavy lifting to attract more people, to retain people. And right now, only jobs, industrial and logistics infrastructure and IT and tech infrastructure is not enough. You need to do something more. And our massive investments in quality of life is a very deliberate move. We knew this as an industrial area. If we want to retain our function as a magnet for people, we need to not invest not necessarily in new factories, but in parks, green areas, taking rivers from underground to above ground. And we invest actually hundreds of millions of euros in that purpose.
Tell us about the river project.
This is co-financed by the EU, actually first project directly financed by the EU Parliament. We saw that in Seoul, Korea, that city government in Seoul uncovered a river literally in the city center. And, this project just seduced me and the mayor. I said, this is amazing, on the main road. And we basically did a copy-paste because this is something that, a typical industrial city, it needs something sexy in the city center. And thank you, our colleagues from Seoul for inspiring us, and we noticed that even in an area very densely populated, you can do something like that. And thank you for the European Parliament for giving us the money to do so.
Is that river now fully uncovered then? And how has that changed people's connection to the river, but also how they experience the city centre?
It will be uncovered December, January.
Okay.
So, next spring, I invite you to central Poland. You can see how you can from no river make a river. It's quite expensive, but it's possible. And water has magical results. Water attracts people. If you have a city center that's not necessarily considered as fully picturesque, you need to make it. And a river is a great aggregator and a great source of life. It attracts people. It makes people to be on the streets, be in this area. And it's a very logically and closely combined this uncoverage of a river with a park which is next door. So out of nothing, we intend to create one of the most vibrant areas in the city center where people will come, read a book, read Monocle, reflect, and just spend time.
And just tell me this eco-transformation of your city. There's lots of things going on in the world. There's lots of pressures. Why did you decide to focus on this issue?
Because we have to. There is no alternative. If you're not a city like Paris or Amsterdam that has natural structure that attracts people, you have to flex, and you have to think how to create in an industrial area conditions for people to live there, to come to visit, and protecting, maintaining, and growing your natural resources, adding to that water, is a natural magnet for people. And if you want to revitalize a city that had challenging time and had this, very, very heavy and industrial heritage, adding green areas and water, especially to the city center that lacked such spaces, it's as much as you can add of the sexiness to such area, something similar that Highline Park in New York achieved. We are not pioneers in this element, but we just aggregated experiences from other cities like that around the world, and we see that it simply works.
Is it easy to bring along the citizenry as well? Because to have more green space means people not bringing their car maybe into the city centre. To put in more bike lanes and places for people to walk, maybe they can't park the car outside their house anymore. Has this relationship, it's a challenge in every city, but in an industrial city where perhaps the car is seen as more important, has it been difficult to change that narrative?
Yes, sir, it was. Politically, it's a challenge.
And what things can you do to persuade people or encourage people to see the benefits? Democratic
politics lives in a constant state of strategic collision, because you have a collision with a strategic goal and the short-term political gain, because your functioning is limited by terms and elections. Oftenly, the long-term strategic goal, or what you perceive as something good, is in a systemic collision with the short-term expectations of your constituents or short-term gains. And it requires quite a lot of political sophistication and communicational work to balance it. We started small with revitalizing a small quarter. Of course, it was a revolution for some of the people, more narrow streets, consuming some of the commercial areas and, dedicating some of the land for example, green areas. And not everything was being done on public land, so we had to sometimes take away some of the private ownership. Of course, with compensation, but it was not fully dedicated for commercial purposes. And when people saw on small piece that it works, that people like such space, that suddenly an area that was lifeless right now is filled with people, joy, kids playing, people reading papers and spending time, brings some other gains. Sometimes indirect, but step by step we were showing that there is some thought behind that, and I think this is the tool and this is a key to success, to empirically show on small steps that it's not some ideological radical idea, but it's really good for the city and most of all good for the citizens.
Andrew Tuck with that report from MIPIM. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Elizabeth Braw and Michael Binion. The show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Francesca Gilks. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.